My wife is not that keen on war films, so I was a little bit surprised the other night when we were looking for a film to watch that she suggested Operation Mincemeat. Now, this is a film based on a true story. Second World War, British intelligence are running an operation to try and convince the Germans that they're going to be landing in Greece, not Sicily, which was the actual target. So, a very interesting true story. The film was okay. I did have some issues with the film, but it did get me thinking about war movies. So today on Dragon's Teeth, I'm going to be talking about my top five World War II films. Hi, I'm Rob Poyton. Thanks for joining me today. So, yes, top five World War II films. Now, I was born in 1963, so along with most people of my generation, I grew up very much in the shadow of World War II. In fact, where I was born and lived in East London, you could still see the scars of the Blitz. And of course, members of my family had been involved in World War II, whether from a civilian capacity or actually serving. Alongside that, most of the toys that I can remember at the time were either like airfix kits, plastic soldiers, tanks, die-cast Spitfires, Action Man. We had things like Commando comics, and then once you got into the 70s, there was that huge paperback boom, reading people like Sven Hassel, Leo Kessler, all that sort of stuff. So you could say that World War II loomed large in my upbringing. And of course, films figured in that a lot as well. So there were a lot of films being made at the time. There were the old black and white classics. And over Christmas, it seemed to become a tradition of having a war film being shown over Christmas. I'm not quite sure how that started, but I would imagine most of us have seen The Great Escape over Christmas at least once. When it comes to choosing a top five, then there's a huge list to draw from, and I'm sure most of you could easily name five good World War II films off the top of your head. Let's get into our top five films, and we're going to start with number five. Saving Private Ryan is a 1998 film directed by Steven Spielberg and written by Robert Rodat. It was inspired by the books of Stephen E. Ambrose and is set in Normandy, France, 1944, following a group of soldiers led by Captain John Miller, played by Tom Hanks, on a mission to locate Private James Francis Ryan and bring him home safely after his three brothers have been killed in action. Now, I do have one or two small issues with this film, but no one can deny the power of that opening scene. I think to date this had probably been the most realistic, visceral depiction of an actual battle, in this case the landings on Omaha Beach, which were fiercely contested by the Germans. Just that opening scene in itself took over 4 weeks to shoot. It cost $12 million and involved about 1,500 actors and extras. So quite a huge undertaking, I suppose, as befits the operation itself, which is the largest amphibious operation in history, still remains so. So I think, yeah, that opening scene in particular is very hard hitting and made all the more so by the way it is framed. Because of course the start of the film we see a elderly gentleman, we don't know who he is, visiting one of the war graves in Normandy. Then we're straight into the landing craft and the story unfolds. And at the end of the film, we go back to that scene in the cemetery. So very powerful visually, but also very poignant film as well, particularly the ending. This is probably the most influential World War II film. Not only did it influence World War II films and series ever since, we can think particularly of Band of Brothers, The Pacific, and so on, but also just the way it was filmed, the way it was shot. We also see that influence in a host of other movies, including superhero movies, for example. I think as well as that, it also inspired a whole raft of video games Call of Duty is the obvious example. And I don't know, I feel like it sort of reignited a bit of interest in World War II, perhaps. I think in England, certainly, we had many years of war movies, but this was the first time we saw it really from that perspective and on such a grand scale. And as I said, depicting the real horror of the situation as well. So very unflinching, very realistic. So that's my number 5 movie, Saving Private Ryan. Number 4 is The Long Day's Dying. This is a 1968 British Techniscope film directed by Peter Collinson, starring David Hemmings, Tony Beckley and Tom Bell, with Alan Doby as Helmut. It's based on the 1962 novel of the same name by Alan White. So in a way, this is in stark contrast to Saving Private Ryan. I get the feeling it's the same time period. We're never really actually told, but it feels like it was possibly Normandy or some point in the French campaign. And here we go from a sort of vast operation to basically 3 paras in a farmhouse. They're behind enemy lines, they're waiting for their sergeant who hasn't turned up. They don't really know where they are or why they're there and what they're supposed to be doing. At some point, a German patrol comes through and they end up capturing a German Fallschirmjäger, a German paratrooper. And that's basically the film. So you've just got these 4 characters. It's a very intimate look of soldiers at work. And this is one of the things I like about it, because how they work, how they operate, looks very realistic to me. It's very understated, but it's very nicely done. I guess the actors went through some training, because the way they move on the floor, for example, or the way they handle the weapons look very authentic to me. And I've had experience in my martial arts training of working with some, well, current and former military people, some on the sort of special forces side of things. And what you get in this film very much ties in with what they talk about and what they teach as well. And quite often there's a certain amount of external dialogue, but not very much. But we get this constant internal dialogue throughout the film. So one of the characters will be moving through and you hear him thinking, right, I'm going through here, better be careful. Where's my cover? Who's covering? Who's covering me? And it cuts back to one of the other paras who's tucked away behind a wall somewhere. And again, you get the thought, I'm covering you. I'm covering you. So it's almost like these guys are so well trained, they've got this sort of psychic link. They know exactly where each other are. They know when to cover each other and everything else. So for me, that's where the realism came in this film, or at least one part of it. The second part comes in the nature of the story, because without going into too much detail and giving away any spoilers, they're behind enemy lines and they've got a prisoner. What do they do? What do they do with him? So this forms some of the dramatic tension of the film. One person wants to kill him, the other person wants to take him with them, all this kind of stuff going on. And then we have the prisoner himself, Helmut. Is he going to cooperate? Is he going to try and escape? So that sets up this tension throughout the film as well, but on a very small personal level. I mean, we get a lot of that in Private Ryan as well, but it's a much bigger canvas, it's a much bigger landscape, there's a lot more going on. This film, to me, really delves into the nitty-gritty of the man on the ground. You really feel like you're walking in their boots. Number 3 on the list is The Battle of Britain, which is, of course, the classic 1969 British war film, with a star-studded cast including Michael Caine, Trevor Howard, Ian McShane, Kenneth Moore, Laurence Olivier, Christopher Plummer, Michael Redgrave, Robert Shaw, Susanna York, and many others. And this film, of course, tells the story of the Battle of Britain, a pivotal moment in the Second World War, when Britain stood largely alone and the Germans had made it all the way to the Channel coast and were preparing Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. First, of course, they had to establish air superiority, so the Battle of Britain was really the Luftwaffe's attempt to wipe out the RAF, and they came very close to doing so. Now, one thing I've not really mentioned so far in any of these films is the kit used, whether that be the personal equipment or the fighting vehicles, the tanks, of course, in the Battle of Britain, the planes. If you're depicting the Battle of Britain, you're going to need a lot of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Messerschmitts, right? This is all pre-CGI. Nowadays, of course, it's much easier to do this kind of thing. But back then, you either were using models, which they did for some of the Stukas in this film, or you're using actual planes. So the producers located 109 Spitfires in the UK. Only 27 of those were available, and only 12 of those were actually still flying. They also negotiated the use of 6 Hawker Hurricanes, of which 3 were able to fly. So that took care of the RAF side. For the Luftwaffe, the producers managed to get hold of 32 Caesar 2.111 twin-engined bombers. These were a Spanish-built version of the German Heinkel HE-111s, which of course were used in the Battle of Britain. The producers also located 27 Hispano Aviación HA-1112 M1L Buchon. That's a catchy name, isn't it, for a plane? But that was basically a Spanish version of the Me-109, the main fighter used by the Germans. So, yeah, if you look closely, they're not quite the real thing. But, in 1969, they certainly looked real enough. And from what I know, from what I've read, the film is pretty faithful to the actual events. Of course, there's one or two things changed, maybe one or two characters switched around a little bit. And this film also resonates personally with me for a few reasons. One, I remember my dad taking me to see this at the Odeon in Green Street. So I would have been, what, 6 or 7, I guess. So that's a nice memory for me. But also, of course, the Battle of Britain, or a lot of the Blitz, fell on East London, where I'm from. So I go back to that family connection as well. My family were involved directly in that. Some of them were air raid wardens, for example. And every now and again, growing up, you'd hear little stories. I think generally not much was said. So many things from that generation were left unsaid. But you'd hear little stories every now and again from my uncles or my nan, particularly. I mean, hair-raising stuff, what they went through. And in fact, it wasn't until many years later that my dad told us how, as a kid, during one air raid, he'd run into the shelter at the bottom of the garden. These were quite primitive affairs, really. Literally just some corrugated iron and a hole in the ground, pretty much. So he ran in on his own. A bomb landed nearby, and the whole shelter collapsed in on him. So at the age of about, well, I guess he was about 6 or 7, the same age as me seeing the film, he had to dig himself out. Quite an experience. Number 2 on the list is Cross of Iron. This is a 1977 film directed by Sam Peckinpah, starring James Coburn, Maximilian Schell, James Mason, and David Warner. So we're now on the Eastern Front. It's 1943, and this film is set in the Caucasus to the south, where the Soviets have just started their big offensive to push the Germans out. The story revolves around a hard-bitten veteran NCO, Sergeant Steiner, played by Coburn, and basically it's about what happens to his unit. Now, this film is also based on a book. It's based on Willy Heinrich's The Willing Flesh, which was published in 1956. So the main plot of the film is the tension that arises between Sergeant Steiner, this hard-bitten veteran, and a new arrival, Captain Stransky, who's sort of Prussian aristocratic background, and this is his first experience of war. He's out on the Eastern Front and he's looking for glory. He needs to get the Iron Cross to uphold the family honour. To Steiner, of course, this is madness, and this type of officer is everything he despises. However, you also get this tension between him and the higher officers, played by James Mason and David Warner, who are more what you might call laid back's not the word, but they're not really that aristocratic type. But Steiner hates them just as much. There's several nice interplays between them. There's a couple of other subplots as well. We have 2 gay soldiers and what happens to them, how Stransky almost blackmails them to get his revenge on Steiner. And that really happens when Steiner's unit are sent out on reconnaissance behind enemy lines. And when they come back, of course, Stransky has arranged it so they're going to be thought of as Russians, or, Russians trying to infiltrate the lines and their own troops open fire on them. And we get Sam Peckinpah's trademark slow motion sort of gun scenes, which he did a lot. I think it was The Wild Bunch was the western he was famous for, where he did that. So there's a lot of sort of slow motion machine gunning and people being shot and everything else. Some people question that, maybe I don't know, stylistically or on grounds of taste, but it works to me in context of the film. The other thing with this film as well is I mentioned the gear earlier. Well, you've got actual T-34 tanks here as well, and all the machine guns, whether they're the Russian PPS-41s or the German MG-42s and so on, well, they were all supplied by the Yugoslav army or the Yugoslav government, because that was stuff they had still lying around. Maybe some of it was still operational even. And it's a war film, but it very much portrayed an anti-war message. One, we had the brutality of the fighting. Two, we see the sort of Nazi fanatic who's in the unit, and then there was a quite a moving scene where the general turns up to pin medals on people, and you got guys there with no arms and no legs and everything else, and it's the general, he doesn't really want to know. He almost throws the medal at the guy, then off they go to have a big sort of feast. In that sense, a very powerful anti-war message, and that's also borne out at the end of the film with the quote that comes up, which I can't remember the exact quote in full, but it's something like, "Okay, so you put the beast down once, but it's coming back again." How sadly true that is. And the film, at least in most of Europe, didn't do so well. It did very well in West Germany, apparently, but in the rest of Europe, in America, it didn't get very good reviews. However, it did come out exactly the same time as Star Wars, so there's quite a contrast in tone there. I mean, you could say they're both military films in a way, yet one was light entertainment or lightsaber entertainment, and the other was this more grim, realistic look at the horrors of war. I think since that time it's become something of a classic, though, particularly amongst war gamers. And, well, my brother and many other people I know, every now and again when you see each other, you go, Steiner! It seems to be a, a lasting legacy of that film. Come and See is a 1985 Russian film directed by Ilem Klimov and starring Alexei Kravchenko and Olga Mironova. The screenplay, written by Klimov and Ales Adamovich, is based on the 1971 novel Katyn and the 1977 collection of survivor testimonies I Am From the Fiery Village. The film's plot focuses on the Nazi German occupation of Belarus and the events as witnessed by a young teenager named Florya. So yes, Come and See is the film I've chosen for my number one slot for various reasons. First of all, this film is a little different in that the other films we've looked at, by and large, are involved in the battles or campaigns of the Second World War, the Battle of Britain, the Normandy landings, and so on. Of course, within that, you do get some mention of civilians, or there are appearances of civilians. But Come and See is set on the Eastern Front in Belarusia, and there's no real battles in it as such, because what it depicts is, to some extent, what happened behind the front lines. Now, we know the Eastern Front was extremely brutal, and there were atrocities committed by frontline troops, but you also had this added horror, really, with the Germans of what were called the Einsatzgruppen coming in behind the frontline troops to implement Nazi racial ideology, which basically was a policy if you were Jewish or Slavic or any number of other things, that basically meant liquidation. And the basic plot of the film, as I mentioned, is this young 14-year-old boy, Florya, who with his friend finds a gun, digs up a gun, and he decides he's going to join the partisans, fight the fascists, help defend the motherland. But what starts off as a bit of a sort of adventure in a way quickly turns very, very dark as the true nature of what is going on is revealed to him. I have to say, if you've never seen this film and you'd like to watch it, and I do highly recommend it, this spares no detail. This is the most hard-hitting film I think I've ever seen, and certainly the most emotionally affecting. I suppose in that sense, and in the fact that it depicts what is going on away from the battlefield, you could draw parallels with Schindler's List. In some respects, it's along similar lines. And also, I think that film and this film, I think they should actually be compulsory viewing, to be honest. At one point in the film, Florya meets up with a young girl who's been away from her village for a short time. She's come back to the village and he goes with her. There's no one there. And in one of the most chilling scenes I think I've ever seen in any movie, we see before the pair what has happened to the people in the village. It's a very well composed shot where the fate of the villagers is revealed, but it is behind the two young people. We see it before them. So we have our reaction, and then, of course, we get their reaction as well. And one thing you have to say with this film, the lad who plays the lead, it's a it's a quite outstanding performance. It's an amazing performance because he starts off as this young, idealistic partisan, and he sort of visibly ages through the film. So the effect of all these events upon him psychologically is really played out on its face. It's an incredible performance from someone so young. And I just want to read a quote here from the director about that. To prepare Kravchenko for the role, I called in a hypnotist with autogenic training because Kravchenko's acting could have had a very sad ending. He could have landed in an insane asylum. I realised I had to inject him with content which he did not possess. This is an age when a boy does not know what true hatred is, what true love is. In the end, Mr. Kravchenko was able to concentrate so intensely that it seemed as if he had hypnotised himself for the role. So yeah, it's a remarkable performance, and as I say, this pulls no punches in. It doesn't hide anything. Everything is shown completely. We see, for example, the villagers rounded up. They're locked into a barn. The barn is set on fire. This is all shown in detail, and rightly so. I mean, the realism even went so far as to them using live rounds during the filming. According to one report, the young lad, I think there's a scene where he's in a field and he's trying to hide, and there's machine gun tracer coming across. Well, they were real bullets apparently, and they were sort of nipping just a sort of 6 or 8 inches over his head. So it's a very real film in that sense. Though, funnily enough, with these odd, almost dreamlike, surreal moments, which I think adds to the realism because I'm lucky I've never been in anything approaching this type of situation. But I imagine when you encounter that kind of shock to the system, to the psyche, some part of your mind must try and escape somewhere else and create almost a safe space to go to, so almost to deny what you're actually seeing. So, very powerful performances from the whole cast. Visually, it's a beautiful film, if I can use that word. Very well shot, very well composed. And, of course, the message is unavoidable. This is what happens when people spread hatred, when people spread division. This is the outcome. Normal people suffer terribly. The title of the film, by the way, that's taken from the book of Revelations. In fact, it's taken from chapter 6. And when he had opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth beast say, Come and see. And I looked and beheld a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And hell is certainly what this film shows in a very unflinching way, and also in a very quiet and natural way as well. There's no added drama or anything else. This is as it was. And just to put this into some perspective, there's a note at the end of the film that says, these events or this type of event happened in 628 Belarusian villages. There we go then. There's my top 5 World War II films. And I think I've got a sort of spread of different approaches to films in there and different situations and different events. But underlying all of them, of course, is that depiction of war in all its brutality. And I think that's an important thing to say because as war gamers particularly, or even someone who enjoys watching war films, we may be accused of somehow being involved in the glorification of war. I mean, we have to be honest, right? We have to be honest. There is a certain attraction to conflict, to looking at the things that are used, the weapons and the uniforms from whatever era, and the tactics and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, we get all that. But underneath all that, of course, is human suffering. We should never forget that. And of course, there are dozens and dozens of films I could have put in this. Some almost made the list. There's all the old classics, The Longest Day, The Dam Busters, The Cruel Sea in Which We Serve, Ice Cold in Alex. You know, then you come through into that sort of 60s era with films like The Battle of the Bulge, which apparently was fought in the American desert in summer and not the snowy Ardennes. Then there's those other great war films like Zulu, Waterloo, Charge of the Light Brigade, of course, as well. And coming into more modern times, Dunkirk. There's another film I watched just recently, quite new, called The Forgotten War, which was very good film. And of course, with streaming services now, we have access to a lot of foreign films as well, particularly Russian films. There's a huge amount of Russian war films out there that are very good. Things like White Tiger, for example. And in terms of German films, Das Boot, of course, is a classic, and the German film Stalingrad, that's also an amazing movie as well. So lots of choice. I'd be very interested to hear what your top World War II film is, what's your favourite ever, but also widen it out a little bit. What would you say was the best war film ever made? I think for me, Waterloo is up there as a contender. I guess we could think of things like Apocalypse Now as well, All Quiet on the Western Front, maybe the films about Alexander or Troy or, going back to ancients or the Roman era perhaps. Anyway, I'll be interested to hear your thoughts. So that's it for today. Thanks again for watching. Thanks to all of you who have subscribed to the channel, all of you sending comments, much appreciated. Please, if you haven't already, do like, share and subscribe. It really will help the channel to grow. I'll see you soon.